This is going to be the quarterly update video for Collective Narrative in spring 2019. We are Sanfane and Gabriel. So to start off, we're going to talk a bit about what we've done since last quarter. Last quarter, we kind of realized that our project is very new, and so, as such, it doesn't have a very strong user base. And so instead of going for a typical user-centered design point of view, we try to go for a tech exploratory approach instead, where we were trying to see what in simple words, how can we leverage this new C technology to create narratives that benefit authors and participants? And this quarter, we kind of narrowed down the scope of it a bit to be less vague. So more specifically, how can authors and audiences be connected in such a way that audiences can incorporate their own backgrounds and experiences into a narrative while still adhering to the author's original vision?
Much of our work this quarter has revolved around the example of murder mystery and how we can use a specific CN to think about our abstractions for collective narrative more generally speaking. And so a lot of our time was spent with this one abstraction, casting, and how we would use it in murder mystery and across other types of collective narratives. And so in the example of murder mystery, an author defines these questions that they want to ask participants to further contextualize their surroundings. So instead of just relying on the CE automated detectors, we can ask them more specific questions that allows the author and collective narrative system to understand a user's context in more detail. So why do we use casting, and what exactly is it? It's the core of how a collective narrative works. It's not just about defining the pre-story questions, but it's also about deciding what roles participants will fulfill and how the rest of the story will be structured and how it will play out. And so in Murder Mystery, we'll see this in the demo, but it's used to cast the users into either the murderer or innocent role. But then it also scaffolds the rest of the story with these participant-defined responses, adding to author-created prompts. And we think it's differentiable from, for example, CE Storytime, because Storytime does not enforce continuity, and it gives participants little context to work from, while we maintain continuity and balance the cognitive and creative effort required from participants and authors through the scaffolding provided by our casting abstraction. So the outcome is twofold for collective narrative. It's both participant-oriented and author-oriented. For participants, we consider them idle users who want to kill time, and we give them a fun, engaging story that they can participate in. The story is tailored to their environment. They're able to improvise. It's immersive, it's engaging, and yet for the author, it's also beneficial because they can create stories with this minimal, concise syntax, and then they can fill in the details through the effort of the participants that are cast into their stories. And so we consider this relationship between the participant and the author to be mutually beneficial. And so what we say is that as the author's effort decreases, participant engagement increases. So this is a really nice relationship. And we want to stress we don't just mean that there's a shift in the workload balance, because we're not simply increasing the burden on participants, because that wouldn't actually increase their engagement. Rather, through the abstraction of casting, we can make this shift in balance mutually beneficial. It scaffolds the contributions made by participants, ensuring their job is easier and more productive than complete unguided improvisation would be. But it also makes much more engaging the experience than simply acting out a predefined character would. So our claim can't be pushed to the extreme. A story with no author involvement at all is not our aim. But there is a balance in CN that we think is novel, that offers new levels of participant engagement with minimal author involvement compared to what other alternatives of collaborative storytelling provide.
Now that we have identified this characteristic of casting, there were several obstacles that we faced while trying to implement it with our existing CE technology. And so one of the first few things that we had to identify was how can participant context be incorporated into the overarching arc of the story? Because like Gabe mentioned earlier, we want the individual situations and contexts that participants are in to affect how the story plays out. And so we thought about the idea of having certain variables that would change depending on what situation the participant was in. A very simple example is the idea of an order. So if person A is in Starbucks and they order a latte, that might affect the story in one iteration. Whereas if a second person plays out the story in a different iteration and they order like a cappuccino, that would change the story and affect its outcome. And so now this led us to face another problem, which was how can the existing C system be improved to gather information about user contexts that are not simply physical. By physical, we mean things that cannot be automatically detected. So currently, CE detects things about a user based on their location, such as city, weather, time of day, what type of building they're in, etc. However, like with the early example of the order, that cannot be detected. And so that's where the idea of pre-story questions came in, because the author would come in and decide, I'm going to need to know what the person ordered in order for the story to function. I'm going to need to know how busy it is for another example, etc. And then thirdly, our biggest obstacle was, how can an API be created to allow authors to write out these basics of the stories just through code?
So the core characteristics of CN start with the characteristics of CE. It's opportunistic, it's location-based and context-aware, but we're stretching that context a step further with these pre-story questions that gather details that aren't simply CE detector-based. And then the other big characteristic is the scaffold that an author writes for a story. And we're going to see that in more detail very soon. But this is the idea that the author just has to write a few concise details about a story, and our compiler will turn it into a full working CN.
So we've created several diagrams to illustrate our how we managed to get the system to work. We'll start off with our author interface model. And so the author interface model is, for the most part, very simple. We take elements of traditional storytelling, such as the title, the description, etc., the setting, and then simply input them in. What the author mainly has to focus on are the idea of these three classes of questions. So one, what information they want to get about the participants before the beginning of the story, what prompts they might want to send out at various points in the story that can act as events, and then thirdly, the characters, where each character will have a defined role, goals, etc., and they'll have like a specific context that determines which participant is cast into which role.
We also have the participant interface model, and this is the idea that the participant just uses the existing Cerebro app, but modified to fit our idea of what a CN looks like. And we'll see this in the demo, but the idea is that there is this synchronous chat where pretty much all the information they need gets sent either by other participants, because it is a group chat, or by our narrator, who sends the prompts that are author written and context defined.
Our system model is pretty complex, but we've outlined the basic flow of it right here. The idea is, once an author has written a basic outline, our C engine will ping users who fit the general context and ask them further information. Once that information is filled out, CN will then take this information and use it to determine which characters or which users will be cast into which roles. And again, these users will be pinged again to play the role of these characters, and they can interact with each other, they can speak with each other, all through a live chat system.
So let's jump into a demo of how CE works. And so we have 3 browser windows open here to show how each user will go through. And so we could sign in Josh, Andrew, and Meg. They all have Murder Mystery available. So we'll start with Josh. He has to name something interesting on the menu. So they sell bagels maybe, and he ordered a latte. And the coffee shop he's in is very busy. Now what he doesn't know is that the narrator, or the author, has defined that whoever is in the busiest coffee shop is the one who will be cast as the murderer. But for now he can go ahead and submit that, and he's taken to the group chat waiting for everyone else. The other people will participate, and they'll say something interesting, that their store sells what they ordered. That one's not busy at all, we'll say. And then lastly, I don't know, ordered a bagel, and this one can be a little busy. All right, so now that 3 people have filled it out, they've all been cast, and the prompts start. So you've seen the Josh is now the murderer, while the others are innocent, and the clues start streaming in. Right now they're sending at a very quick pace. This is just for the demo, but you can consider these coming in every 2 minutes maybe, and these prompts will come. They'll say, okay, look, our first clue, the murderer is in a busy coffee shop. And so everyone will have to react to that. And so, for example, Josh, as the murderer, will try to throw off his fellow participants by sending a picture of an empty coffee shop. And the idea is he would take this picture himself, and he would say something like, look guys, it's not that busy, and send that along. And there's his image. Now, little do the other participants know, he just took a picture of the coffee shop that doesn't happen to be busy right now. But as he told us in that pre-story question, the coffee shop is busy. He's just not showing everyone else. And so this person can say, I don't believe you. And then more prompts can be sent from Josh. Josh can send more pictures. Andrew can send pictures of his coffee shop because Josh can say, hey, I think you're the murderer. And the story will sort of rise with the tension. And if the prompts come in every 2 minutes, you can see the next one, the murderer ordered a latte. So you can consider all the participants will probably send pictures of what they'll order. The murderer will have to find another way to throw people off of his trail. And this is what will make it harder for the murderer as more of his context gets revealed. And as you can see, they would cast their vote. And lastly, they find out who the murderer is, and they find out it is Josh. And so this is where those prompts are coming in. The author wrote these, which we'll see in a second, but then the user-defined response are coming in right here, latte, bagels, and then the murderer being Josh. And so that's the CN system at work. Here's our synchronous chat. As you saw, it was updating across. It supports images, text, and that's what collective narrative looks like right now.
Cool. So now we want to answer the question of how does it work? So we'll take a quick dive into the code base for collective narrative. The core idea behind this is that we function on two levels, one on the CN level and one on the CE level. And so we'll start off with the CN level. So as you can hear, this is the code that an author would write to create a CN. And so this is, for example, what an author would write to create murder mystery. So very basic things are in here, such as like the name, what everyone should be in a coffee shop, what people are notified that they're going to participate in a murder mystery, etc. Here, the author writes things like specifies which questions you want to ask. So like, what's on the menu should be a question, and the response should be in the form of text. Same things with things like orders. And there might also be other questions that have drop-down responses, which are different, which function differently. And then here he can specify the prompts. So you can see that, for example, for prompt 2, the information relates directly to the order, which is here in question 2. And so whatever the murderer submits for question 2 will be used in prompt 2. He can also specify things like the timing. So here, right now in our demo, we specified so that these prompts cast every 3 seconds. Obviously, this would be longer than an actual scenario. And then lastly, the author would also define character roles. So here we have 2 archetypes. We have the murderer, who his goal is to avoid being caught, and we have the innocent people, who is everyone else who wants to find the real murderer. And so at the very end, the author can simply put these in as parameters to our conversion function, and CN will do the rest. As for our conversion function, it's for the most part very abstract. It does things like, for each question that the author submitted that they wanted to know before the story, create both the question and the response type in the form of a UI, and then have it in our template. Other things, we'll scroll down real quickly, create what we call needs. And so these things will prompt users in the specified location. So the author specified coffee shops, for example, so there'll be a need prompt created for every single person. Once users have submitted their pre-story information, the callback will occur. And so here is when the actual casting occurs. So if we scroll down to, for example, here, this loop iterates through each user submission and determines which character they'll be. So for example, we have things that check for what responses were, and if it fits what the author specified for a certain character, then they'll be cast as that character and a new need will be created. And so once all these needs are created, then the experience is fleshed out, prompts are sent again, and characters can start interacting together.
And so this is the code that just ran the demo you saw. This is what an author would have to write. And so, for example, if we wanted those prompts to be sent at a more reasonable timing length, we would just change these numbers right here. If we want to change the questions we ask, we just change them here. And you can see the questions asked. So for example, name an interesting option on the menu, takes in the menu. That's what the author defines it as. And they can use that menu later on in their collective narrative code. So here's the last clue. The murder's in a coffee shop that sells, and then they plop down that menu variable right there. And so this makes it really easy for an author to use this context-defined information and to make a CN nice and simple. All right. So takeaways. The continuity class as a whole extra set of abstractions that we've thought about for collective narrative that we haven't had time to implement or really flesh out the arguments for. And so we want CNs not just to be these bite-sized experiences, but we also want them to kind of connect together for people to see larger stories emerging from a trend of participations or from other people taking in others' roles. Characters can be defined with participants and vice versa. And so this is something that we really want to explore further. We also want to deploy Murder Mystery and test it on participants. We've tested a lo-fi prototype, but now that we have the tech working, we'd love to deploy it and run a real user study. And lastly, testing the user interface for authors. So we've written the beginnings of what an author syntax would be. Now we'd like to put it in front of authors for a user test and see if they're able to write stories with our code. That's it. Thank you.